Hello there. My name is Mark Meadows. We are going through very weird, difficult, and for many people, traumatic times. And amongst many other communities and professions, the acting community, the theatre community is suffering because it's predicated on people meeting and creating and playing in the same space. But we are lucky enough that we can still converse virtually at the moment. So it's my pleasure today to be chatting with Wiltshire Creative Connect's Artist of the Week, the distinguished fight director, Paul Benzing. Hello, Paul.
Good morning.
And just quickly, is fight director your preferred title? I know that, people sometimes talk about fight choreographers or combat people.
Yes, I think so. Most people talk about fight directors, but fight choreographers or just fights, really anything like that, I'll answer to that.
Very good. Now, I should just let anybody who's listening know that Paul and I've had the pleasure of working with Paul on the Salisbury Playhouse stage, in fact, during the Magna Carta plays that Gareth Machen directed in 2015. And so Paul, amongst other things, was telling me how to fall over better and more safely. In fact, safety, that's something that obviously is paramount, because people obviously think about fighting and the danger and the appearance of violence, but obviously that's something that's important to you.
Yeah, that you've touched on really the most important thing of having a fight director, whoever it may be. Safety, the safety of the people fighting on stage, and even the people watching, but also the safety of your audience, who are never that far away. The front row is never that far away. So if people have got swords or being disarmed and weapons are flying around, we need to make sure that everyone is safe.
Sure.
And of course that also applies. I myself don't work in films and television, but a number of fight directors do, and of course there's lots of very expensive equipment lying around, and you've got to make sure you're not smacking that with a sword or a hammer or anything like that.
Yes, as an actor, I've often felt more expendable than the equipment sometimes.
I guess I think it's
not from your point of view. the people who have their hands on the purse strings.
Exactly. Yeah, the important people.
Now, I mentioned your illustrious career. Just to give a brief overview of it, Paul's very well known for his work on, amongst other things, Warhorse. So not only has he worked at the National Theatre, but most, if not all, of the major UK theatres and regional theatres, including, of course, Salisbury. So I suppose the most obvious question I'd like to ask is, where did it all go wrong? No, where did it all start? I mean, how did you get into it?
Well, thinking back, as a fight director, really the journey began when I started fencing, modern competitive fencing, and I was 9 when that happened, and that's more years ago than I care to think about. But I was fencing for many years, with no thought of turning it to anything other than just the sport. But I eventually went to drama school, and it was at drama school that I was introduced to stage combat. And all the fencing stuff that I had learned served me extremely well for that aspect of fighting with swords. Obviously, there's the whole unarmed stuff as well, but that's what really gave me I suppose, the grounding for doing.
And would you say that which is obviously a particular strength, has been an avenue you've gone down more, or because in my experience, I've been lucky to work with not only you but other distinguished fight directors who seem to be masters of all trade, good at all the various techniques that but have you done more fencing, or is it just the way it works out?
Yeah, it's really the way it works out. Currently, there's a big sort of martial arts thing going on in films and television, and of course that kicks back into the theatre. But yes, so armed, unarmed combat. I teach people how to fall downstairs, for instance, things like that. People just to fall over. In Warhorse, there are a few what you would call fights, choreographed fights, but most of what I do is people being shot and falling over and being blown up. And of course, they've got to be safe doing that.
Yeah. And also, because one of the things, talking about the safety of it, one of the things that as an actor you're always reminded is that you don't have to go hell for leather, that usually 70% pace and effort is, once the technique of a particular sequence is there, is more than fast enough to convey the narrative of a fight to an audience whilst doing it with ease and relaxation and safely.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I always say that when we're doing a play, you're telling the story, and most of that story is told using words. Well, you wouldn't walk on stage and speak as quickly as you possibly can, because we know no one will follow it. Similarly, with a stage fight, you could get to a stage where you're doing a fight really very quickly, but obviously that becomes more dangerous, and of course the audience only get to see it once. So you do need to emphasize the points that need to be emphasized in the fight, in the same way that you would in any kind of dialogue.
Yeah, sure. So we sometimes verbally talk about giving a word space or air, so that it's almost, in inverted commas, presented to the audience for them to have the time to digest it. So I suppose it's an equivalent thing.
Yes, that's right. Typically, something simple like a punch or a slap. We know the impulse. If you're going to really hit someone, you're not really going to telegraph it. Yeah. You're going to do it really very quickly and suddenly, because you actually want to hit them. You don't want them to get out of the way. Well, of course, on stage, you actually want to telegraph to the audience, I am going to punch this person, and oh, there I am. I've done it. Yeah. Hopefully, and that I think that's the nature, certainly of theatre.
Sort of generous punching.
Generous, yes, yeah, absolutely. Everybody should see it.
Just going back to how you started, or the path. Were there any particular influences or inspirations, or people that perhaps mentored you in the early days?
Yes, I was taught by a guy called Phil Stafford when I was at drama school. So he played an important part in my understanding of modern stage combat. But I was also particularly fortunate to subsequently work with a guy called Jonathan Howell, who I know you know. And I was also fortunate enough to work with the great Bill Hobbs, who did a great deal of film work. And the two of them, especially Jonathan, made me realize that not only could I do it, but I could actually make a job of it. It could be a profession.
Great.
And that's a thinking back as well, to get that kind of encouragement from people that you admire is extremely useful.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that I thought about Jonathan's approach was that it was very holistic, because I know that he trained and worked as a dancer, and he was good musically and had worked as an actor. And do you think that feels like an important thing, that there is an interrelationship between the different disciplines, and that they're not discrete things?
Yes, so I mostly work in theatre with actors, but I've done shows for ballet companies with dancers. And obviously operas, things like that, and you have to have an understanding of how they work, so that you can sort of slot into what is required. And of course that's quite a big part of the job when you're asked to do something, is, well, what is it that the employer actually wants, without being too specific. You do need to know about the context of the play. You might imagine you're going to do Shakespeare, it's set in Shakespeare's time, and of course it never is these days. They're set all over the place, and so you need to have that information in order to serve the production.
Sure. So in opera, have you had to encounter people saying, well, I won't be able to do that move because I can't sing like that.
Yeah, that is that's a big thing with the opera, and understandably so. As someone who doesn't sing, to produce that kind of sound, you do need to be you can't be out of breath, chasing around. So that is a big concern for doing an opera. But generally speaking, I think in fights, the best way of doing them is to speak or sing, then do the moves, and then go back to doing the speaking and singing. So hopefully you can work a way round so that everybody can be accommodated. So not just the performer, myself, but also the director, who's obviously got ideas as well.
Sure. Well, that's something I'd like to touch on, because so you're obviously presupposing that a certain amount of work has been done, so that so that the actors or the singers can give you something to work with, and you've already had an idea of the style and the mood of the piece from the director and various other people. And I suppose that you get different amounts of time depending on the organisation. So sometimes you feel you have to do a quick job, and sometimes you feel more sort of you're just there more. Because I know as an actor, I'd want the fight director there all the time if I could, but I know that logistics and money don't.
Yeah, and that is a big problem, because there are a number of big companies, the National, the Royal Shakespeare Company, a lot of the West End producers, who do have enough money to say, how long will it take to do this? I can give them some idea, and they'll go, yes, that's fine. But quite a lot of companies don't have that sort of money, so they will say, this is what we want, and this is the amount of time we can afford to have you. And then you have to get into a negotiation about, well, there probably isn't time to do this bit or that bit, but the rest of it's okay.
Yeah.
And that, of course, can also depend on the people involved, because obviously most actors will have done some kind of fight training at drama school, and I usually have the basics down. But sometimes people come through a different route, maybe have never done any fights. So you do have to spend some time going over the most basic stuff with them to make sure they're safe.
Well, yes. Talking about safety, because my wife, who is in the profession, but she came from a different route, so she didn't go to drama school. She was in music. She was trained as an opera singer originally, but she's done quite a lot of theatre and musicals now. And I think this is one of our daughters was small, and she was saying, Mummy, how did Daddy do that fight in that play? And I remember hearing it from the next door. There was this sort of sickening. The safe distance was not applied, which is one of the first things Jonathan taught us. Safe distance, and there was this awful sort of clump of bone on flesh, and then the inevitable crying. And fortunately, social services weren't called. But this is folks out there. This is very much don't do this at home unless you've had the adequate training.
Yeah, exactly. It's because sometimes the margins of throwing a punch or a slap are quite small. But they do have to be there, and the difference between it being successful and unsuccessful it is often not that big.
Well, yes, because I was wondering about things like difficult theatre stages. For example, in the round is the most obvious thing. That if you can hide a punch much more easily if the viewer is on one plane and it's going from back to right, say. But if the whole point of being in the round is that at some point you are going to be seen by everybody, and you can't. It's very hard to fake a distance. So you must have come across that. And were there times where you've had to come up with clever misdirections or whatever?
Yeah. Generally speaking, theatres are either proscenium. That's where the audience is all on one side of the acting space. But for instance, at Salisbury, they kind of wrap around. So it's
slightly
like like 3/4 they're coming around the side there. But in the round is a problem, because however fast you do it or however competent you are, there will always be someone somewhere in exactly the wrong place, so that they can see what the conceit is, how you're hiding it. And one of the things I've found very useful is if there are other people on stage, is to get them moving around. So let's assume that there's a theatre in the round and 2 people are fighting in the middle, and there are maybe 3 or 4 people goading them on or whatever around the side. As they start punching or kicking, you can actually move the people around the side to, at the appropriate moment, just cover the gap that would be seen when they were throwing a punch or a kick that didn't actually make contact. And if you do it reasonably discreetly, then that can work extremely well, you know, which is one way around doing that kind of thing.
I suppose a bit like just going across the shot in a camera shot. There's sort of
yeah, exactly. On a screen, even if you just make a cut from somebody doing that to it hitting there, then you suddenly go, oh, you know, he smacked him in the face, even though he hasn't really.
Just going back to when you first, each first time you approach a production, because I think obviously we think in what you do in terms of all the techniques and the dynamism of it, but it must be very important to create an atmosphere of trust with people, you know, because you're meeting people perhaps for the first time, and then within half an hour you're telling them to punch each other's lights out or drag them by their hair around the room or something. So for an aspiring fight director, it's not just, would you say it's not just learning those skills, but there are wider skills to develop?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The technique is stuff that obviously you can learn, and you can say this is right and this is wrong. But there is then, how do you actually convince someone that they can do it? And I think, as I said, a lot of actors have done the basics. So often they turn up with the attitude that they do know what they're doing and they have some idea about it. But sometimes you meet people who really don't know and they feel very exposed anyway being in front of an audience. But then if they're doing something they're really not happy with, and that's where you have to go back to saying, okay, you put your foot here, you turn that way, you prepare this way, you do this. And I always try to get them to do it at a speed where they can actually think through everything they're doing. So it's almost like doing a mime, actually doing it very slowly and deliberately, because as I always say, you can speed it up anytime. You can get faster and faster. That's not a problem, as long as that technique is sound. And so hopefully, you know, with talking them through what I'm doing, and I you know, hopefully they realize that we are there to produce an illusion. We're not there to hurt anybody. That's what it's about. It's producing the illusion of violence. It should be possible to actually guide somebody safely through all of that. In fact, I remember talking to Jonathan, who we've mentioned.
Yeah.
I think he went to somewhere like Latvia when the Soviet Union opened up to do some teaching with the National Theatre there, and they were astounded that you can actually throw punches and grapple and wrestle with people without being hurt, because they'd been taught by policemen and special forces. And whilst they are the same techniques that you often use, there is a very different emphasis on the way they're taught.
Yes. So they tended to leave the word stage out of the phrase stage combat.
Yeah. just muller someone, basically. That's which we don't do. We don't do anything like that.
No. Talking of anybody aspiring fight directors, are there any bits of advice that you could give people apart from the things you've already talked about?
Well, I guess the thing to do is to watch theatre and watch films and television. Obviously, a lot of people would aspire to work in films and television specifically. And then actually to go to somebody that you trust to learn from, because there isn't really there isn't a school of stage fighting that you can go to and learn these things. You learn them at a drama school, but once you've left drama school, if you need to go and learn and refresh. Some of the teaching bodies do have summer courses that you can go on, but inevitably they're very heavily booked. So yeah, watch what's going on and try and relate what you understand in terms of the technique, in terms of what they're doing in that production, because you'll find that if the technique is sound, it is you can reproduce it, and that is another thing. You've got to do a fight in a play like Warhorse, which is on tour for a year, so they've got to know they can do that fight safely in every performance for a year, which is quite a long time to.
And do you go back in at set intervals to just check it's running over, or you have people that do that for you?
Yeah, in big shows like that, part of the contract is that I have to go and watch it occasionally just to make sure that they are all behaving themselves. But the bigger shows also have fight captains, which is like another duty. So they're there every day. They're usually in the cast, and they make sure that there is a fight call. So before every first performance, every day, they go through all the fight content of the show.
Yeah.
Just even if it's just, they go through it even if it's fairly gently, they can actually talk to each other and say, that was a bit close last night, or you can be a bit closer. All of that kind of stuff is really important, not only from the safety point of view, but to keep what they're doing fresh and immediate. Because if people get stale doing a fight, complacency can easily enter the equation, and then somebody will get hurt.
Absolutely. And apart from the safety aspect, from my point of view, because you don't always, unless there's a fight call or an official warm-up, say, you don't necessarily have to see your fellow cast members before you see them on stage. And it's always a nice thing, if nothing else, just to say hello, or, I'm going to slap you around the face later, before you actually do it.
Yeah, exactly. Just to have that discussion. Just make sure that it was everything was okay for you yesterday. Yeah, and everything was okay for me. Okay, we'll reproduce that, hopefully.
Are there any? Would you say you've had a favourite scene or play that you've created a fight in, or any that spring to mind?
Well, a show that's always great fun to do is something like The Three Musketeers. There's a lot of fight in it, which is great, and a lot of people fighting. But also it's a fun show. Another of the important aspects of the job is, if you're working on a production, is to find out how serious it is. Are we looking at a ultra realistic fights? Where people are. You could look at them and think, actually, have they actually hit each other? Sort of uncomfortably realistic, right through to doing something like a pantomime, where everybody, all the cast members, all the audience know it's pretend, and that's the nature of the thing. And various productions, of course, come somewhere along that spectrum of whether it's something really serious or something very, very stylized. And then it's a question of then trying to make the fight work in that context.
And is there a fight or a discipline or technique that what's the fight you've never done that you'd like to?
Oh dear, I can't think of a production that I've of a show. I would personally like to, myself, just purely personally, I would like to do more films and television, mostly because I haven't actually done that. And although the technique is very similar in both disciplines, it's understanding how it works on a film, on what it looks like on a screen, because on a stage you're using a big canvas, as it were. You've got to, everyone's got to see it. Whereas, of course, on screen as we are now, of course, it's actually quite contained.
And the edit is very important as well, because I you often hear people, directors who've gone from theatre or back between theatre and film, saying that they like the editing part because that's most like directing in the theatre, not the dealing with the actors on set.
Yeah. Well, I guess well, I guess that's the thing, isn't it? Because that is where, for them, that's the final performance. That's the thing you're going to see. And this is another thing, going back to what you said earlier about watching. You can watch a fight, watch it through at speed, then go back and watch it, and you go, oh, well, they've cut a bit out there. That the actual distance that they've covered, that they've edited that in a way that the logic doesn't flow, but the actual physical sequence of it flows better.
Yeah.
The way they've cut it.
But short of teleporting across one side of the stage to the other, we can't do that in the theatre.
No, that is the thing.
Now, finally, Paul, have you had any, without naming too many names or too many mishaps, are there any funny stories or things that have happened to you in your career that you'd like to share?
Well, I've been fortunate enough to work with some names, what one would say, and one of the things that always strikes me about the big name artistes is that when I'm working with them, and when anyone's working with them, they're not big named artists. They're just actors. They're like me. They're like you. They turn up on time with the lines learned, sober, and that's really the most important thing. They're not grand. They're very happy to try whatever I suggest, and that's really important. They don't start going, oh no, I can't do that because I'm not going to do it. They always try it. That kind of thing. But one tale of warning. I was in a production of Henry VI, which comes in 3 parts, as you know. I can't remember which part we were doing, and there's a lot of fighting in those plays, a lot of fighting. And this was one where a move went wrong, and it was in a fight. In all of these fights, there were lots of people, armies clashing, all this kind of stuff, and there was a fight that had just 2 people in it, of one move, and the one move went wrong. So yeah, and it's one of those things where you just go, you've got to be on the ball all the way through it. So yeah.
Very diplomatically put. Well, Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure for me to talk to you, and thank you to the listening audience out there. Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, and thank you, and I hope it's not another 5 years until we work again.
Well, exactly. And hopefully we will all see each other again, not virtually, but actually.
Yeah.
Very soon.
Yeah. Amen to that.
So stay well and stay safe, everyone out there.
Yeah. Likewise. Cheerio. Bye.